Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Robert Calafiore. I'm the Associate Dean of Administration and Finance at the Hartford Art School, University of Hartford, and welcome to tonight's Arts and Healthcare, Koltenuk Arts and Healthcare lecture. It's my pleasure to introduce Nancy Stewart, Dean at Hartford Art School. Nancy.
Thank you, Bob. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you and thank you for joining today's Koltenuk lecture in Art and Healthcare. Since 2011, the Hartford Art School has offered a service learning course entitled Arts and Healthcare, designed and taught by Associate Professor of Painting Kat Balco. This course introduced students to art's potential as a healing, life-affirming force. It is a popular elective that leads numerous art students into studying art therapy at the graduate level. Not long after, Hartford Art School Endowment Incorporated board member and university regent, Deborah Koltenuk, established an endowed fund in honor and memory of her cousin and a 1978 ENHP alumna, Hildy Koltenuk, to explore the connection between arts and healing through an annual lecture series. The first Koltenuk lecture in 2017 was by Kathy Melchiati, a board-certified professional art therapist with over 30 years experience and author of numerous books on the subject. Her lecture was titled Arts and Healthcare and Creative Art Therapies, Healing Arts in the 21st Century. The second Koltenuk lecture in 2019 was with Alexa Miller of Arts Practica in New Haven. Her lecture dealt with uncertainty in medicine and promoting the visual arts as potentially critical to medical education. She is a fellow at the Society for the Improvement of Diagnosis in Medicine, and her lecture was titled Looking with Uncertainty, Inquiries into the Visual Art Practices for Good Medicine. Both professionals came to campus and spent a day with students in Professor Balco's class, as well as ENHP students in Professor Claudia Oak's course. The COVID pandemic postponed our third guest from 2020 to today in our first online presentation. But before I introduce you to my co-host, I want to highlight another collaboration that is scheduled for fall of 2021. We will be featuring the design and craft of prosthetics in a major interdisciplinary exhibition entitled Bespoke Bodies from the Design Museum in Boston. This exhibit and related programming will explore the relationship between craft, design, materials, and the human body through tactile objects, case studies, user stories, the design process, and future concepts. Details about this exciting exhibition will be available on the Hartford Art School website early this summer. Now, joining us to introduce our speaker is my co-host and colleague, Dr. Thompson, Dean of the College of Education, Nursing, and Health Professions. Ches?
Thank you, Nancy, and good evening, everyone. And it's great to be collaborating with you and the Hartford Art School on these great programs. This evening, I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Susan B. Framtom. With more than 30 years of experience, medical anthropologist Susan Framtom understands how healthcare is shaped and experienced by a variety of forces and how those forces can be restructured to create better health, better care, better cultures, and lower costs. She has traveled the world, bringing her vision for improving healthcare quality through compassion and partnerships to more than 30 countries. From the beginnings of modern medicine, the arts have served a unique role. Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, emphasized the importance of including the arts in the healing process, recognizing that supporting our human need for beauty, inspiration, and a connection to nature lifts our spirits and enhances therapeutic interventions. Dr. Framtom's presentation will explore the connections between healing and the arts and share practical examples of how the arts are being used to enhance the patient experience of care. And these are wonderful, I'm sure, applications that all of our students and others in the audience could relate to. And I'm very pleased to hand this over to Susan. Dr. Framtom.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon and to have this opportunity to talk about one of the things that I'm very passionate about, the role of design and the arts in creating environments of care that support health and healing. So I am actually going to go very broad in this presentation. It sounds like perhaps the earlier speakers have focused pretty deep. So I'm going to start out actually by talking a bit about the history, just a few important points in the history of healing in the arts. And I'll go through about 400,000 years in about 6 slides. So it'll be very broad. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about a number of some of the most current philosophies around design today in healthcare. Evidence-based design, experience-based design, and patient-informed healing design, and some of the principles that shape the way that we are influencing our care delivery environments today. Then I'll share with you examples from healing environments around the world. And as mentioned, I've done a lot of traveling. I spend a ridiculous amount of time in hospitals and clinics in different parts of the world. But it's really fascinating to see how these human design principles have become ubiquitous in many, many different parts of the world. And then I'm going to finish up with what I promise will be a very concise review of some of the research literature on healing design to really underscore the importance of research and the evidence for the connections between the arts in many different forms and healing human beings. So let me start by just saying, survival, health, healing, the connections of these things to the arts have been with us for a very, very long time, almost from the very beginnings of our time as humans in some form. And as an anthropologist, I found those connections between our very early roots and the way that this relationship with the arts and healing has evolved to be fascinating. During the era of the Neanderthals, which was the period about 400,000 to 40,000 years ago, the arts were largely expressed in tool making to procure food. So very, very practical. There's actually little to no evidence of healing practices or the use of the arts to express thoughts or feelings about what Neanderthal life was like, or the lives of very early Paleolithic peoples. That changed, we know for a fact, about 20,000 years ago. And some of the very first artistic representations that we are aware of occurred by the later Paleolithic times. And cave art at that point had arisen, and it's there to give us more clues to these sort of nuanced relationships between healing and the arts. This is one of the very earliest cave paintings that depicts an eviscerated bison and the hunter that the bison has wounded during the hunt. It's found in cave art in Lascaux in France, and it's dated to between 15 and 20,000 years ago. It's very likely that back then, early humans were attempting to both understand their world and its dangers and to document those dangers visually as a strategy to increase their chances of survival. So capturing it in this visual cave art rendering was an important way of committing it to memory and to the cultural memory of the group. Later, cave art became a bit more sophisticated and delved further into the supernatural world, and in particular, the impact that early humans felt that the supernatural world had on their ability to survive and to be healthy and to live their lives. And so we begin to see cave art representations of shamans and representations of their more elaborate rituals, which were, we believe, a part of this drive to ensure the safety of humans, particularly while they were involved in the hunt. And we also begin to see evidence that music becomes involved in these sacred rituals to optimize outcomes. And we see now in some of these caves archaeological evidence for flutes and other musical instruments that are in these ceremonial cave sites and we believe were used as a part of these rituals at that time. So from the very earliest times of humans really being humans, the way that we conceive of ourselves, we've linked our survival and our health and healing to place and to a sacred or a ritual space that was set aside especially for practices that were intended to influence positive outcomes. So while these special areas of caves with the cave art and the musical instruments, we might not exactly think of them as early hospitals, but they were the beginning point of those different concepts coming together for human beings. So within these spaces, we see very early on visual arts, we see music being especially important as a means to capture and represent and express the spiritual and mystical nature of the forces that shaped humans' lives back in those times. Now we're going to jump ahead from the Paleolithic to historic times, and perhaps one of the most significant leaps that occurred was in the times of the ancient Greeks. And in the introduction, Hippocrates was mentioned. Hippocrates is very important when we think about modern medicine, and that he put forward at the time a very novel concept that disease was not actually supernaturally caused, but it was naturally caused. So it wasn't about spiritual influences, it was natural influences, and therefore could be cured by rational methods. So Hippocrates, who is widely acknowledged as a father of modern medicine, understood these very essential links between mind, body, and spirit, and the need to address all of these in order to support health and healing. So Hippocratic philosophy emphasized things like a healthy mind and a healthy body. Three main categories that Hippocrates laid out were observed in his provision of care around health promotion, interventions in trauma care, and mental care and art therapy interventions. So health promotion included physical activity. This was the time of the Olympics. There was quite a bit of focus on the physical body and optimizing physical health, but also there was a focus on interventions on trauma care. And Hippocrates actually pioneered some of the early trauma care interventions, again, influenced by what was going on at the time, many wars during that period of history in ancient Greece. And then lastly, mental care, behavioral health, and art therapy were very, very closely aligned in the belief that mental and behavioral disorders, and again, Hippocrates was the first person that we know of who classified these disorders. He believed that art therapy interventions in particular were very important in the treatment of mental and behavioral disorders. And in particular, music and drama were used as management tools in the treatment of these illnesses. In fact, the role of music and theater in the treatment of both physical and emotional challenges, as well as the improvement of human behavior, was deemed to be essential. And the entire city of Epidaurus was used perhaps as the very first comprehensive example of a healing environment, an entire healing city, and one that incorporated the arts throughout. So this is actually a photo of the very large and impressive theater that was used for dramatic performances, for poetry readings, etc. And it was believed that this was a very important part of the healing approaches used at that time. We also find quite a bit of historic focus on healing the soul through music, because it was believed that the body and the soul and emotions and spirit were all really a part of the same whole. And so there were specific musical applications used at this time for certain diseases. So for instance, the alternating sound of flute and harp served as a treatment for gout. And there were many other musical treatments for specific ailments. Other essential elements that we found in Epidaurus and in this concept of a healing environment included spaces that were designed to incorporate and maximize natural light and views of nature. Two other things that in the Hippocratic philosophy were believed to have a very important influence on health and healing. Now I want to jump forward about 1,300 years to another important point in time. And in many ways, this is the exact counter to the Hippocratic philosophy around health, healing, and the arts. And we go to the 1860s and Joseph Lister. And this is an incredible leap because of, in many ways, the negative impact on the concept of a healing environment. So Joseph Lister pioneered antiseptics and the use of antiseptics in clinical settings. So why is this so important to the design of healing environments? Well, his sterile technique was really a game changer in the operating room. Saved countless lives. Hospitals, however, began to take this really great idea for the operating room, and they adapted it throughout their entire facilities, attempting to sterilize just about everything you can imagine. Removing items that were from usual daily living in an effort to have this fully sterile environment. So no plants, no soft furnishings, harsh lights, hard surfaces, and mainly the sounds of machinery and the distress of other patients. So effectively, we took a very important clinical improvement and we used it to create very cold, very institutional environments. And this continued through the 1970s, 1980s in many healthcare delivery environments. So there were unintended consequences, as you can imagine, for the vulnerable human beings that were being cared for in these types of environments. And the picture on the right is one of the iron lung polio wards from the 1950s. I try to imagine a less comforting place to heal than in one of those very sterile polio wards. So just 100 years later, I think of the 1970s, 1980s in many ways as a design enlightenment age, because we really began to get a handle on the subtle and not so subtle effects that these institutional environments were having on patients, their families, and the staff that worked in them. And this is actually where Planetree, the organization that I've been with now for almost 21 years, this is where Planetree came in. Because Angie Turiat, the founder of the Planetree organization, experienced the then modern hospital environment in the 1970s after she had moved to the US from Argentina. She settled in San Francisco with her husband, and she became deathly ill from a virus of unknown origin. She ended up in a large academic medical center in the San Francisco area. And while she will admit she got wonderful clinical care, probably some of the best clinical care that she might have received anywhere, she said that she was so traumatized by the environment of care and its influence on human interactions in that environment that she felt this was absolutely not the best that we could do. That trauma really led to her challenging the physical and emotional barriers that we had erected in our care delivery settings in an effort to keep people safe from germs. So she came away inspired to make change, to fundamentally change our system of care delivery, both the physical environment of care, but also the way that care was delivered. Because she, I think, was very well aligned with Hippocrates. She believed in mind, body, and spirit, and the connections between those things. And the idea that in order to optimize health and healing, we had to address all of the different aspects of the human condition. So she pulled together a group of very out-of-the-box thinkers for that time, and they began to innovate around care delivery and what could a truly healing environment really look like. So she worked with these folks. They included the founder of the Whole Earth Catalog, for those of you who might remember that, the chief medical officer of Kaiser Permanente, Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen, who wrote Kitchen Table Wisdom, and many other really innovative thinkers. And they sat together and said, what's missing from today's hospital environment? What is it that actually gets in the way of healing people? And they founded Planetree on this principle of looking at everything that touches the patient through the eyes of the patient, and to use that as a guide to change the way the care was being delivered. Angie actually envisioned hospitals that could make a person feel better simply by walking through the door, very similar to the vision of Epidaurus 1500 years before. And in fact, she chose the name Planetree for the organization because of its association with Hippocrates, who is reported to have sat under the shade of the plane tree on the Isle of Kos when he taught the very first medical students. The patient-centered model that Angie and her pioneering colleagues developed included many, many different aspects of a healing environment. So let me just go through some of those. The first being this idea of breaking down barriers between staff, patients, and families. Now, it's kind of ironic because we are re-erecting some of those barriers today because of the coronavirus pandemic. But at this time, she really saw things like the big plexiglass, cocoons around nursing stations, and really no place for families to sit, by the bedside with their loved ones. She really saw that as, antithetical to healing, that it got between people and the relationships that were a part of healing. Her concept was, where are people most comfortable? Where are any of us most comfortable? Most of us are most comfortable in our own homes. We create a certain feel or vibe in our homes that's warm and comforting. And her perspective and Planetree healing design principle was around creating that same warmth, that same comfort in the healthcare environment. One of the other things that they incorporated into this design principle was privacy and noise control. Again, her experience in the hospital in the 1970s was that it was incredibly noisy and there was very little privacy. And those are two things that cause a great deal of stress for many, many human beings. She thought about the importance of family. And when she was in the hospital experiencing her hospital stay, for most of the time, her family was not allowed to be at her side. And she found that incredibly distressing. She had just come from Argentina, a very family-centered culture. And she just felt like the absence of the warmth and the love of her family to be able to be by her side when she was most vulnerable just did not make sense. So she and her colleagues incorporated into this healing design principle spaces set aside for families so that they would be welcome and encouraged to be a part of the healthcare team. She also observed during her hospital stay that everything seemed to be beige. And it's interesting, I certainly have found that in some of my own travels, not so much now. I think people have gotten on board with the idea that color is actually a positive thing, and that, a can of, yellow paint or red paint or blue paint doesn't necessarily cost any more than beige paint. So she began to sort of infiltrate the thinking around color. And then of course that opened it up to artwork. Again, principles that we went back 1500 years, people understood, but somehow we lost them as we began to sterilize our healthcare environments. So artwork, color, natural light, controllable light from the perspective of the patient, incorporating natural elements like gardens, water features, animals. Plaintree was one of the early proponents of pet therapy in healthcare environments. And then of course, music and other therapeutic modalities and distractions. So these are the Plaintree healing design principles. And this is work that our organization has tried to carry forward as we go about making culture change or helping organizations to make culture change in a way that will better engage patients and their families, as well as our professional caregivers, and design spaces that they can feel whole in, they can feel healthy in and supported. Many of these principles garnered the attention of the research community, the design community. The early Plaintree units were featured in the New York Times and many other leading media outlets, and it helped to really launch a revolution in thinking as well as research on the impact of the clinical environment on health and healing, what we now refer to as evidence-based design. And evidence-based design, of course, looks at the impact of the care delivery environment on the health outcomes of the patient that is being cared for within that environment. And I included this description, this quote from the Center for Health Design in their website, because they are a wonderful, wonderful source if you're looking for research in particular on healthcare design, evidence-based healthcare design. You can go there and you can find it. So just as importantly as evidence-based design, we began to ask this question of ourselves: what's the patient's personal, individual experience of the built environment in which they are being cared for in? How does their experience potentially affect their health outcome? How does the space feel from the patient's perspective? What are they seeing from the hospital bed or from their wheelchair? And how does that view impact them? Roger Ulrich did seminal research in the 1980s that suggested that the patient's experience of their therapeutic environment affected their clinical course. And this was some of the earliest research that made this connection. His research indicated, and he was looking at American and European populations, but he found that people tended to favor a certain aesthetic, and they had certain responses to nature, that they preferred natural scenes to more urban scenes in either the artwork on the walls or the views out of the windows. Views of vegetation and especially water could elicit very positive feelings in patients, reduce fear in subjects who were stressed, hold attention, and block stressful thoughts. The results of this study of the view through the hospital window suggested that natural views actually had therapeutic influences and resulted in faster recovery, shorter length of stay in the hospital. Those results also helped to garner support for this concept of the healing healthcare environment, and that some of these nuances, like what's the patient looking at out the window, were really important and that they deserve greater attention. And so this whole field has continued to grow and develop and inform the way that we now look at the design and build of our healthcare environments. One other really important piece here that I will say, and I think it's a parameter of healing design that Plaintree has had a pretty major contribution to, and that has been the idea that it's wonderful to have trained professionals designing our environments, but it's also very important that we involve the users of those environments in the design. And so in Plaintree's approach, we also talk about patient and staff informed design. and making sure that our design teams include the people who will be delivering care in those spaces and the people who will be receiving care in those spaces. And so involving patient representatives, family representatives, members of the community, nursing staff, pharmacy staff, as well as design professionals is a very important part of designing the best possible healthcare environments. So this growing evidence-based and experience-based design literature, as the research grew, it really created an expanded context for a host of new elements that we believed were impacting the human experience in the clinical environment. And the Planetree model of care embraced those elements, and they've significantly changed our approach from one based on opinions, or maybe we've always done it this way historically, to evidence-based design interventions, and to looking at what do the facts support in terms of design, and understanding that there's a broader context than just the built environment, but how care is provided within a truly healing environment. And so in this model, we looked at how the environment impacts human interactions, whether it's between the patient and staff, or family and staff, or family, patients, and staff. We look at access to information, the extent to which we make it easy for patients to access information to help reassure them about what is happening to them in an environment that often feels out of their control. It includes social support, and how do we ensure that the support network of the patient is a part of the healing environment, that there are spaces for that. It looks at the role of arts and entertainment, because we know many patients spend days and days, and in long-term care settings, years in these settings. And what are we doing to make sure that we are using the arts, that we are using any opportunity around entertainment that can help to stimulate people? Understanding the role of spirituality. And many of the healthcare environments now have some sort of a spiritual room, a place. Again, if we think back to 20,000 years ago, those very early spiritual spaces where there was music and there was artwork. And now in many healthcare settings, we have chapels, we have respite areas that incorporate these different elements that help to lift the spirit. Recognizing that human beings need caring touch. And again, along with that the adoption of sterile technique, there was less touching. And by the 70s, we had gotten to a place in many hospitals where the only time patients were touched by staff was when they were having an injection or a treatment or a procedure, something uncomfortable or distressing. Gone were the back rubs and the pat on the arm, and the time for a slow and caring bed bath. So recognizing caring touch is an important part of the human healing experience. Looking at not only modern Western therapies, but what sort of traditional therapies or integrative therapies might be important to sustain some individuals in the healing environment. Taking into consideration things like food and nutrition. And one of the reasons that this was a part of the early Planetree model was some of the seminal research findings that suggested many people, when they left the hospital, were more malnourished than when they entered it. And I know there's been this joke for a very long time about hospital food. There was actually a punk rock band called Hospital Food. We've made a lot of progress around hospital food, but again, one more thing that is important to the human experience. And then also looking at what is the influence not only within our building, but the connections to our communities outside of that. So we're going to continue to see this evolve in new ways. There's no doubt about that. And as you might imagine, the coronavirus pandemic has required adjustments to healing environments to ensure safety. It's challenged our ability to balance safety with a humanized environment of care. For example, As I mentioned before, barriers are back in many hospitals, and we need to make sure that we find ways to maintain human connections despite all the plexiglass that's dividing us today. Overall, we need to continue to look at the totality of the healthcare experience from the very moment that the patient steps through the front doors until the moment that they depart, and to find ways to continue to use the environment to support these many elements of what can be a very person or individual centered care model. So per Angie's vision, this idea that from the moment you walk into a health center, you should feel a sense of inspiration, of confidence. It should be soothing, it should be welcoming, it should be uplifting. These are some examples from hospitals in the US and Lebanon using elements like a hearth, like greenery, natural light, music, even music piped into the parking lot to welcome everyone as they enter this very important place of healing. Integrating elements from one's local region, another important thoughtful consideration, for example, palm trees in Lebanon or a fireplace in Colorado. These are ways of providing familiar and comforting environments to greet people as they come through those doors. Once inside, many patients find the healthcare environment confusing, difficult to navigate. Actually, so do some of us employees. And so wayfinding actually has become an art form in its own right. And it's a very important art form in helping us to address this challenge of wayfinding. So these are some examples from Saudi Arabia, from various locations in the US, where they're using artwork and particularly different pieces, sort of unusual pieces like the clay pot as cues around navigation, using colors, using visual themes, like this example in Virginia where different floors of the building are themed in a different color and a different icon. The fish tank, the wall fish tank, being used in Saudi Arabia, not something that you're going to forget in terms of where you are, and certainly a useful wayfinding point for a staff member to be able to say, take a right at the end of the fish tank on your way to wherever you're going. And then the very interesting use of floor inlays in this hospital in California. And each of the elevators has a different set of natural artistic floor inlays, which again can be used in wayfinding. So these kinds of creative ideas really do a lot more than just allay somebody's fear of getting lost or being late to an appointment. They actually are a cost reduction methodology as well. And there have been a number of studies that have been conducted on wayfinding, particularly in large hospitals, and the annual costs that have been calculated are upwards of $425 per bed per year. And a lot of that is the hidden cost of staff, in addition to information booth staff, which are occupied in having to take people places, try to help them with wayfinding when we've not done a great job of using art in this way to assist with wayfinding. So there's been a number of studies that have found cost reductions when we actually make this investment in using art in wayfinding. Family spaces, I talked a little bit about this earlier. This is another very, very important aspect of healing design, including these spaces for families so that they can be present near to their loved ones in the clinical environment. We know that inclusion of family members in the care, treatment, and discharge planning of their loved ones improves health outcomes. It decreases the chances of readmission. So creating spaces for family to be able to stay at the bedside, to meet with members of the clinical team, to be there when physicians are rounding, even to prepare food on site for their loved ones in a unit-based kitchen like the one shown in the bottom left. These are all elements that we see in healing healthcare environments today. Again, we have seen some erosion in the use of some of these spaces given the concerns around virus transmission. Now, I think it's unfortunate, and we need to be very careful about the unintended consequences of isolating family, particularly from hospitalized loved ones and also from elders in long-term care facilities, when we have seen higher incidence of morbidity and mortality because of social isolation. And I think it really underscores in many ways the importance of including family, as viewing them really as a part of the care team, an essential part of the care team. And of course, then making sure that there's space for them to be there in a healing environment. There's a lot of advocacy work being done right now. We're involved in many efforts currently to ensure that we appropriately weigh the risk of virus transmission with the risk of social isolation as we navigate our way through this pandemic and out the other side. So when we talk to patients and we talk to their families about different elements of the healthcare environment that are important to them, we find in most satisfaction surveys that both patients and families talk about privacy, that one of the key areas of opportunity is improving personal privacy. Recall again the photo I shared of the 1950s polio ward, and then compare that and contrast that with today's environments of care that include single-bedded rooms like the one pictured here, a pull-out couch for a family member to sleep at the bedside, private registration areas in the bottom left, and private respite spaces for families and caregivers. Again, the evidence-based design research has helped to make the case for including these kinds of spaces in many hospitals and healthcare settings. So in addition to the need, just the human need for privacy, there's therapeutic benefit as well from improved sleep in a single-bedded room, better infection control in a single-bedded room. So again, facilities that are designed with these spaces were actually better equipped to make the needed adjustments to protect patients and staff during the pandemic. Control of noise is another one of those things that we see on patient and family satisfaction surveys. We know from the research literature that many clinical environments have issues with noise levels. They're problematic. They can and do negatively impact both the health of the staff who work in these areas, as well as the patients that are trying to heal in these areas. The evidence base connecting high noise levels to increased stress levels really encourage creativity around noise control. And these are some examples, including things like decentralizing the nursing station. So instead of having one large area where a lot of people are congregating, having work pods spread throughout a clinical unit. Also looking at the different types of materials that can be used, soft vinyl flooring instead of hard flooring, carpeting in some areas, again, to help soften and absorb noise. We've seen all sorts of different noise monitors in use. This is just one I thought was kind of funny, the red, green, and yellow, and if the decibels get too high, the red light starts to flash. Maybe not the most artistic application, but again, so important for us to think about how we can create healing environments and control noise. You know, one of the more subtle aspects of this noise control is actually the use of the recessed softer lighting, because we have found, again, in research on human behavior, that as light levels come down, voices also come down. And so, again, there's such interesting connections between the built environment and human behavior that we can use to optimize healing environments. Lighting and daylight, I've talked a little bit about the importance of natural light. It may seem contrary to what I was just saying about dimming lights, but there's a benefit to more light as long as it's natural light and it's at the right times. It's been shown, for instance, that patients in a brightly lit room have a shorter length of stay compared to patients in dully lit rooms. Research has found that patients hospitalized for severe depression have reduced their stays by an average of 3.5 days when they are assigned to a sunny room rather than a sort of drab room overlooking spaces that are in shadow. Many healthcare settings have designed in things like the floor to ceiling windows that you see in the bottom left, skylights in indoor patios like this long-term care center in Canada, atriums to maximize all of the potential natural light in this example in Oregon. So really trying to capitalize on natural light and its uplifting effects on patients, their families, and on the staff working in these areas. Similarly, just as Hippocrates theorized, access to nature is also a very important element of the healing environment. Here, there are examples from Brazil, Malaysia, and the US of outdoor areas, including rooftop gardens, outdoor dining spaces, facilities in very densely populated urban areas in particular, like this setting in the top center in Sao Paulo, Brazil. They've gotten very creative with their use of rooftop spaces, of spaces that often are considered not to be accessed or utilized. And they've created some wonderful outdoor spaces for patients, visitors, and staff. So we talked a lot about design features in the healthcare environment, but the actual design of space, while incredibly important, is not the only way that the arts in particular can play a role in healing. We can design therapeutic distractions and alternatives into the healing environment, and that's also an essential thing for us to focus on. So we can use art, and we see this many places now, including my dentist's office, where we can soften technology. And you see some examples of these backlit ceiling tiles or wall panels in Saudi Arabia and Malaysia. We see these now all over the world. People are beginning to realize when a patient is on their back in a testing facility or a treatment room, their view is the ceiling. And so what can we do to make that more appealing to our patients? Other sites use animal visitation, alternative and traditional therapies to create a softer, more familiar environment. We see these examples of animal visitors in the Netherlands, and some of the use even of chickens actually in long-term care settings, which I thought was kind of cute. Mostly I have experienced dogs, but people have gotten very creative with that. And then also honoring traditional approaches to healing that maybe are not a part of the modern medical model, but have meaning to some of the people that may be cared for, as in this drumming ceremony, which was, that photo was taken at a hospital in Arizona. Food is another really important therapeutic distraction for patients in clinical environments. In fact, it's often the only thing they have to look forward to while they're in a treatment setting. And so design can be used to create either a restaurant feel or a home dining feel, as you see in some of these examples. Food can be used as a vehicle to welcome people. And I experienced that when I visited this hospital in Lebanon. They were very creative with their artistic food presentation. You know, again, I had mentioned earlier, one of the reasons that this focus on food was included in Planetree Healing Design Principles was because of that research done early on about people leaving the hospital more malnourished. And so it's important that we understand that it's not only what we provide for people to eat, it's where we provide it, it's how we provide it, you know, what it looks like, what it feels like, in addition to what it tastes like. So again, food is love, right? Many of us come from cultures that would say food is love. So in addition to some of these other sort of arts applications, obviously art in itself, visual arts in particular, have been fully embraced by most clinical settings that I'm familiar with now. And it certainly makes sense when you think about our early beginnings as human beings and the importance of art as we expressed our humanity. And so where better to be expressing that than in a healthcare setting? And these are just some lovely examples of art in hospitals in Qatar, in Malaysia, in the US, but pretty much anywhere you go now, you will generally find some beautiful examples of local art. And then, of course, we see in many long-term care settings and dementia care settings, the use of art as a therapeutic course. Music, of course, just as important and a wonderful way to augment a healing environment. Again, our early roots tie us to music as a healing modality, and that's continued to blossom and to develop in many healthcare environments, including some of these examples, musicians performing in the clinical areas in hospitals in Brazil and the Netherlands, patients and residents having access to their own musical instruments to express themselves, the use of music to ease the passing of dying patients, in this example of a hospital that offers music thanatology in Colorado. I thought you might find this recent example of the use of music and its ties to healing kind of interesting. You know, we're striving, of course, around the world to get our populations vaccinated. And we know, again, based on the literature, that many people, and particularly those with dementia, may experience a great deal of anxiety and agitation over the vaccination procedure. And so this is a site in the UK. They're using music as a therapeutic distraction. So they're trying to put people at ease and try to manage their emotional responses. So while they get a dose of vaccine, they also get a dose of music at the same time. They're finding it to be very helpful. Just as important as these many examples that I've shared around design and the arts to create a more healing environment for patients and families, it's also important to focus on the need to design spaces that support our healthcare professionals. And these are just a couple of examples of staff exercise areas, of break rooms that again are incorporating natural light, that are incorporating greenery, break rooms, this stairwell some of you, if you've ever been to Griffin Hospital, this is a stairwell in the hospital. They have very ugly elevators, but they have this beautiful stairwell with murals and carpeting, and it's a way of encouraging staff to take care of themselves and to exercise and to use the stairwell. So we can get very creative also about how we use the arts to motivate healthy behaviors. And then my last example, I thought this was kind of cool. This is an example of performance art that's being used. And in this case, this is actually a scene over the bridge in Rotterdam. And there are a couple of artists known as Studio Drift. They staged a surprise performance in the skies above the Dutch hospital in a tribute to their frontline medical workers, also in commemoration of the 75th anniversary of Dutch Liberation Day, which is when the country was freed from German control at the end of World War II. These are 300 illuminated drones that flew over Erasmus Medical Center and formed beautiful hearts and different artistic patterns, again, as a thank you to the frontline staff there. So lots of different ways that we can use the arts, all kinds of different arts, in creating healing environments. And of course, the question that I often get as I travel around and try to advocate for some of these things is, well, how do we know that these different elements of healing environment really make a difference to health outcomes? How do we know that this is a good use of our resources? And I'm going to try to very quickly, because I know that we're getting close to the top of the hour, just go through a couple of interesting pieces of research that helps to tie outcomes to some of these design elements. This was a study that looked specifically at 2 rehab hospital units, one which incorporated those plane tree healing design elements that I've talked about, one that was just sort of a traditional setting, and they found statistically significant improvements in the length of stay, meaning length of stay came down in the plane tree rehab unit, cost came down as well, and patient satisfaction went up. So it did make a difference to patients. They did notice that. A second study 10 years later, conducted by Sam Burnett, looked at the neuroscience and the impact on neuroscience of environmental components. So particularly fish tanks, art, softer environments, views of nature. And he had 100 different photographs from plane tree hospitals and healthcare environments, and 100 different that were taken from a Google word search on images of those same types of environments in traditional settings. And they showed those to a series of individuals, and 73% of the respondents chose the plane tree photographs or images, and basically said it had a strong positive effect on their emotional reaction, that they felt that was the type of place that they would prefer to receive care. So in some similar research, and maybe some of you may be familiar with Dr. Harlan Krumholtz. He's really just an amazing researcher at Yale University, and he's looked at the impact of the hospital environment on healthcare outcomes, and has described a phenomenon that he calls post-hospital syndrome. And it really is just, it was kind of mind-boggling when I first learned about this. So he analyzed discharge diagnoses. He looked at the top 4 or 5 discharge diagnoses, and he compared them to their 30-day readmission diagnosis. So readmissions, for those of you who may not be in the healthcare space, there's intense amount of focus on readmissions in healthcare quality because they're too high, and we want to try to bring them down. They increase cost. They are a risk to patients' health. And we've always tended to think about 30-day readmissions as a failure, right? A failure in the course of the treatment. And we've sort of assumed that patient comes in, let's say they're admitted for heart failure or pneumonia. They're treated, they're discharged, and then before a month is up, they're back in the hospital again. And we've always seen that as a failure. Obviously, our treatment didn't work, but Krumholtz's research actually found that the majority of patients being readmitted in that 30-day window were being readmitted for something totally different. It was not linked to their original diagnosis. But he posits to the very fact that they spent time in a hospital. So, in other words, just being in a typical hospital environment can make people sick, and had made them more vulnerable to the manifestation of an additional illness after their initial illness and discharge. So why is that? Well, again, think about the types of insults that a vulnerable, ill individual undergoes in a typical hospital environment. There are sleep interruptions constantly, loud noises, artificial lights, bright lights at unusual times that interrupt our normal biorhythms. There are restrictions on movement, on food, on water, lots of painful stimuli, lots of uncertainty. So Krumholtz in his research compared these kinds of conditions that we create in very non-healing environments to the conditions of studies that have been done on mice. And when we put mice in similar conditions to those that are described, they get ill. And it's based on allostatic overload. We overload their system. They're overstressed, they can't deal with it, and they get ill. Krumholtz posits that this same overload affects human beings in a very adverse way. And his model for post-hospital syndrome lays out just how these factors of non-healing environments induce extreme stress that can then result in negative impacts on their functioning, on the quality of life, and on the expression of symptoms. So pretty sobering to think about the potential impact of non-healing environments. And then finally, and this is kind of to bring this full circle, when we think about healing environments, we've got to keep in mind we are still in an active learning situation in terms of the subtle connections between our bodies and the places that we spend time in. And recall now Joseph Lister's sterile approach to hospital facilities and that trend to try to sterilize everything. Recent research actually suggests that that approach has very likely gotten us into big trouble. In a study on the hospital microbiome, researchers have found evidence that the superbugs that we're now all so concerned about because we're seeing them more and more in healthcare environments, they're likely caused not by harmful bacteria in the treatment setting, but by the lack of helpful microbes that we have all but eliminated as we've striven to disinfect everything around us. So if nothing else, this should remind us to be humble about what we know or what we think we know, and to realize that the connections between our care environments and our ability to heal ourselves is changing all the time. And so I hope that this presentation has given you some food for thought. And if you've wondered if designing low stress, calm, quiet, natural environments that include the arts and beauty, if that makes a difference, I hope that you can be assured that it does indeed, and that connecting our patients to music, to nature, to the arts is very beneficial. Really, all around the world, we find these same kinds of benefits. And so the many ways that we have shaped and we continue to shape our healing healthcare environments is indeed affecting people's lives and the lives of their families and the lives of our professional caregivers. Changes to those environments can provide the foundation for improved clinical and experiential outcomes. Today's challenge includes not losing the gains that we've made in creating healing environments with the needs that have emerged to keep each other safe in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. I hope that we can learn from the past and remember that just because sterilizing the operating room is a good idea, sterilizing every space may not be. So erecting plexiglass barriers in some areas may be needed, but putting everything under a protective plastic bubble may have unintended consequences that we have not yet even begun to conceive of. So thank you so much for your time and your attention. And I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have, or I'd love to hear any comments that anyone who's participating may have. So shall I stop my share? Is that the best way to?
That would be terrific, Susan. Thank you.
Okay, there we go.
And there are some questions coming up in the Q&A, and Cesarina or I will go ahead and ask you some of those. One of them is more of a comment. I imagine that environments also benefit the staff, which leads to improved care. I think you covered that a little bit, but is there anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this underscores the importance of making sure that there's staff representation on design teams, because there are things that staff need that architects may not be familiar with. And it can be really small things that impact their health. For instance, I remember an example where in a patient treatment room, they were putting all of the, the outlets at a certain height. And when they actually had the staff that were going to be the ones using those outlets come in and look at the prototype of the room, they said, oh no, that will result in back injuries. It needs to be at this level, not that level. I think also some of the outdoor areas that I shared photos of, I know that staff really value that ability themselves to get outside, to get away from sometimes the very intense clinical environments that they're in. So it's so important to think about it in many ways. People spend most of their waking hours in these environments when they are professional health caregivers. So very important to be looking at healing environments from their perspectives.
Susan, I'm just going to have two comments, and then I have a question from somebody in the audience. So one person commented what a wonderful place Griffin is, and she wishes that there were more Griffins around. So if you haven't had the opportunity to go there, anyone in our audience, it is a neat place to visit. Another person asked about, are the fish tanks real or virtual?
Actually, the answer is both. I will say that most of the ones I'm familiar with are real. And obviously fish tanks take some maintenance, but they're beautiful and they're very calming. And I've seen them used often in cancer centers, in pediatric areas, and in waiting areas. And people just love to sit in front of them and watch the fish go by. They're very, very calming. I have also those seen in some clinical environments where they don't feel that they can keep up the maintenance and they have concerns, or there may even be local regulations that prohibit fish tanks because of the water element. I've seen them use it's like video fish tank, which, I mean, I don't personally favor that, but if it's that or a blank wall, then probably video fish is not a bad idea.
Let me just ask one more. I thought this was a very interesting question when you using the evidence-based principles. And this person asked, do you know of any studies exploring the relationship between evidence-based design principles and violence against healthcare workers?
Wow, that is a really interesting question. And I cannot say that I am familiar with any particular study, but I am willing to bet that there are studies that have looked at that connection. I mean, it just makes sense, right? That if we are creating a more healing environment and we are using those evidence-based design principles and it helps to calm people and de-stress people, that I would imagine there could be a connection to preventing escalation or violence. But I would encourage people to go to the Center for Health Design website, because I think they've got one of the best bibliographies of research, evidence-based design research. And I imagine if you're going to find it anywhere, you're going to find it there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another question, Susan. What have we learned about the reduced availability of the arts from our COVID year?
Well, I think one of the things that we've learned is that artists are incredibly creative, if we didn't already know that. And I've just seen some amazing ways that artists have met the challenge of not being able to be physically present in healthcare environments. I mean, as you may know, there are many, many hospitals, in particular, long-term care centers as well, that have active music programs, have active arts programs, and they have been discontinued in terms of people being able to be on site. So, people playing guitars in the hallways, we're not seeing that right now. People coming into a patient's room and engaging in art activities, we're not seeing that right now. However, we are seeing artists that are doing concerts in parking lots and concerts outside of windows, and doing, sort of art installations or performance art in a way that patients can see them even when they're not in the same rooms. So people have gotten creative. Again, my hope is that we come through this and we make sure that we appropriately reinstate the kinds of activities that will continue to be safe. And I think a lot of the arts programs are ones that we'll be able to reinstate as we get our population vaccinated. That's my hope.
Terrific. There's a question about, well, someone's wondering if you're familiar with UConn Health as the hospital's new additions have used these methods you're talking about.
Well, I have not been there for a while. I'm actually a UConn grad, so I should probably go back at some point and check things out. I mean, that's always been a beautiful facility in my mind, and I can only imagine that a more recent build or renovation, I would imagine they've done a remarkable job.
Susan, I'd like to ask a question. I tried to put it in the chat, but I think as a panelist, it won't let me. But for all the art students that might be in the audience, I'm assuming most hospitals have curators who select and budgets to buy art. How would an artist connect with the hospital to show their work, sell their work for possible placement in hallways and rooms and spaces?
That is a good question. I will say, I think larger hospitals have curators. Most hospitals, community hospitals or smaller hospitals, do not. And the individuals choosing artwork I mean, it could be the volunteer director, it could be somebody in nursing that just has a passion for it, it could be the hospital CEO. I've seen everything. It sort of runs the gamut. So it's, again, so I would say for a larger hospital, I think about in our own state, St. Francis or Hartford Hospital, they may very well have art curators. I mean, St. Francis, I worked there for several years, and they have a phenomenal art collection, just incredible. I would imagine they've got a curator, and you could probably call their information line and find out who that is, and that they would be open to additions to that collection. So I think that would be a good way to go. I think, yeah, in terms of other hospitals that might not have that position, yeah, I'd say maybe start with volunteer services. They often have a finger on the pulse of everything going on in the organization, and they might be able to help an art student who's interested in connecting with them. One of the other things that I've seen in some settings where they may not have a huge budget for art, they welcome community artists who agree to have their art hung, and it's kind of passive promotion of their art, and people can actually buy pieces if they choose to. So that's another thought. And I know, again, many community hospitals would just love artists who want to volunteer to get involved in launching an initiative like that, to have community art space.
Great.
A question that I thought was interesting as well, and this relates to the use of these principles in places where patient safety may be especially important. Not that we don't worry about patient safety all around, but in a mental health setting, perhaps, where you might have acutely ill patients with psychiatric illnesses. Is that an impediment, I guess, from using these principles?
Well, I think that in behavioral health settings, you've got to be more thoughtful about the type of visual art, for sure. I've actually worked in a hospital where art was swapped out because people sort of had a negative reaction to it. And that can be patterning, it can be colors. Interestingly, though, and again, you had mentioned Griffin Hospital, and it really is a wonderful example of a healing environment. They have a locked psychiatric unit, and they have a fish tank in that unit. And it's beautiful, and people love it. It's very relaxing, but it's unbreakable glass. They don't use breakable glass. And they've created an unusually home-like environment there. And I will say there is a phenomenon where people tend to respect and treat a beautiful environment differently than kind of a crummy environment that they're in. So yeah, there is that as well.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's been wonderful. And if any of the panelists have any final questions, otherwise I think we are at the end of our time. Cesarina, do you have anything else that you would like to ask or say before we close our talk for tonight?
No, I want to thank Susan and Nancy for bringing us all together. For the students in the audience who are healthcare students, I mean, I just think this is a wonderful reminder that it's much more to bring healing to patients than just being technically competent. It's certainly, using self as a healing force is very, very important. So all of the things that go along with Plaintree, using our own communication, but also emphasizing the arts that do bring lots of healing in their own way. So I hope that the students take that away from this presentation, that it's really much more to healthcare than the technology that we've seen over and over, over the years, as you pointed out. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Terrific. And before I turn it over to Nancy for some final words, thanks to the Koltenuk Fund for providing us this opportunity, and ENHP and HAS for hosting this event. Susan, to you, to all our students, to everyone who's here. And over to Nancy and Susan for any final words. Thank you, everyone. Have a great
Yes.
night.
Thank you, Bob. We all look forward to when we can gather again on campus and share our artwork, share our music, share our research. And Susan, I hope you'll come to campus when it's safe and allowed, because I'd love to show you around the art school, and I'm sure Ches will give you a tour as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you both. And I'd love to come and visit. And I will just say, if anyone has additional questions that they didn't have a chance to ask, or they think of it later, please feel free to reach out. I have an open email policy, so I'd be happy to engage with any of you. So thanks again, everybody. Have a lovely evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.